and welcome to Foolish Musings. In this episode, we'll be examining thought in ancient Mesopotamia. As per usual, I'd like to start with some disclaimers. In this episode, we will be discussing not a single individual, nor even a school of thought, but rather a culture. We'll be discussing the relatively uninterrupted proceedings of thought, magic, and writing that existed between the two rivers, and I'll discuss that a little bit later when we talk about definitions of Mesopotamia. This is important to understand because I'm going to be discussing a topic that isn't necessarily internally cohesive, even more so than some of the other thinkers and other schools of thought that we've discussed previously. And as such, although I will be raising some key themes and points, it's important to understand that there is a lot of diversity in the texts that do exist, in particular the Cuneiform texts written by the inhabitants of Mesopotamia themselves, but also because we're looking at a culture sort of two steps removed. We are examining some of their original texts, which have been gratefully translated over the last 200 years or so, but we're largely limited in the fact that we also have to interpret these texts and this culture sort of in a sense completely removed. We don't have any direct insight into the culture that we're looking at, and we're reliant upon these texts and material finds and some of the other writings of neighboring cultures, for instance the Hebrews, to give us the context about what we're actually listening and reading about. And in this sense, Mesopotamian thought is something that we are sort of, in some sense, trying to understand but create in the process of reading. So what do we mean by the term Mesopotamia? Mesopotamia is an ancient Greek term. Meso meaning between or middle, and Potamia meaning river. And what it refers to is the landmass between the two rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Most commonly this is thought of in terms of as a cultural area to refer to sort of the areas of now southern Iraq. But the term has been broadened in both Assyriology and other classical studies, more to refer to the entirety of this river system stretching up through Syria into now southeastern Turkey. This is one of the great cradles of civilization, one of the great early river cultures, including other such cultures as Egypt, the Indus Valley culture, and also the Shang in China. And it's important to understand because it forms one of the most important fountainheads from which the influences onto later Greek and thus Roman and Western thought appear, but also, even though it doesn't continue on necessarily in its own written texts, in fact many of the texts of Mesopotamian cultures are not recovered until the 20th century, or at least the late 19th, it's important to understand because it provides an overview of those basal cultures which feed into later Persian and Hebrew thought, key to understanding the religious traditions which go on to dominate the world in the form of Abrahamic religion. Now, Mesopotamia was important for many reasons, and one of the most key ones is that it is known as the cradle of civilization. As part of the Fertile Crescent, it was one of the first places in the Western world, as in the western parts of Eurasia and North Africa, where there was the development of agriculture. Ancient Mesopotamians, particularly in the southern areas, closer to the Persian Gulf now, we saw the development of basic agriculture, including the harvesting of grains such as wheat and barley, and also the cultivation of dates. There was also the domestication of numerous animals, including pigs, cows, sheep, and goat. And all of these things allowed for the generation of agricultural surplus. Now, this is an interesting thing because we actually see the general health and quality of life of people moving from a hunter-gatherer society to a pastoralist or a more particularly a sedentary farmer society decreasing. So people become less healthy and have less good lives. In fact, it's not until the 1800s that we see humans returning to the same sort of physical stature as their earlier hunter-gatherer forebears. And it's important to understand that this turn to agriculture might actually have been a turn of desperation, where people, devoid of any other means of generating enough foodstuffs to survive, are forced into this more intensive form of development and subsistence living. And the important thing to note, though, is that it allows for the generation of things such as breads and beers, two key staples that will be very important for Western culture over the next couple of thousand years, but it allows for the generations of surpluses. And with the generations of surpluses comes stratifications in these different societies. Now, when we talk about the birth of agriculture, there is an assumption that we immediately move from sort of this nomadic lifestyle directly into a sort of an urban style of living. And I think it's important to highlight the fact that despite agriculture becoming more important, there is still a perseverance of different modes of living. So yes, some people do involve themselves in agriculture, but others also involve themselves in sort of a pastoralist style lifestyle, living on the fringes where the land is not as good for intensive crop production, and still others live in coastal or riverine areas or swamplands, sort of living a sort of a fishing style existence. And these three sort of mechanisms of lifestyle, including traditional sort of hunter-gathering styles of living, continue to coexist for a long time in Mesopotamia. In fact, you need to remember that we're talking about, it's still around about a 4,000 year period where farming has been invented, but cities aren't really coming into being yet. People are still existing in loosely affiliated tribal groupings, sometimes in clusters of maybe huts and villages, and then slowly over time these are coagulating into something more. But there is always a sort of a to and fro in the fringe between sort of these more urbanizing groups and these more rural fringe groups. And it's this tension between the urban and the rural which plays a key part within Mesopotamian society. Now, with these increasing agricultural yields, there comes a bit of a situation where you have an issue where you've got these sedentary farmers who now have a larger stockpile of resources, which allows for certain aspects of the societies they live in to focus on things other than being agriculturalists. But you also have these other groupings who are living on the fringes, so pastoralists, and even other more warlike agricultural groups. And the thing is that this sort of drives people away from these fringes and closer together into these more hierarchical organizations because of the safety that they bring. It's easier to steal food from another group rather than to earn it yourself. And so even though there is cooperation between pastoralists and those who are living in the more sedentary societies, there's also that competition aspect. And as people are driven together into these urban societies, and there's an even greater concentration of wealth and agriculture, there's more drive to have these non-agricultural classes who are focused primarily on other roles, whether that be administration, artisanship, or, as war becomes more important, the aspect of warfare and the warrior. And so in this sense, this natural feedback and this interplay between these different lifestyles and the natural inequalities that occur within a sedentary agricultural society, you see the birth of the city. And this is where we have the first real urban centers. And these appearing around about 5,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia, and this is where we have the first real urban civilizations. Now, with these increasing agricultural yields, there comes a bit of a situation where you have an issue where you've got these sedentary farmers who now have a larger stockpile of resources, which allows for certain aspects of the societies they live in to focus on things other than being agriculturalists. But you also have these other groupings who are living on the fringes, so pastoralists, and even other more warlike agricultural groups. And the thing is that this sort of drives people away from these fringes and closer together into these more hierarchical organizations because of the safety that they bring. It's easier to steal food from another group rather than to earn it yourself. And so, even though there is cooperation between pastoralists and those who are living in the more sedentary societies, there's also that competition aspect. And as people are driven together into these urban societies, and there's an even greater concentration of wealth and agriculture, there's more drive to have these non-agricultural classes who are focused primarily on other roles, whether that be administration, artisanship, or, as war becomes more important, the aspect of warfare and the warrior. And so in this sense, this natural feedback and this interplay between these different lifestyles and the natural inequalities that occur within a sedentary agricultural society, you see the birth of the city. And this is where we have the first real urban centers. And these appearing around about 5,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia, and this is where we have the first real urban civilizations. So the most important of the first cities to develop, they developed in the southern area of Mesopotamia, in an area now known as Sumeria, just to the very north of the Persian Gulf, and involved several key cities including and Lagash. So these cities developed very antagonistically. So even though they're part of the same culture and they're developing the same sort of religious and cultural ideas and traditions, they're very much in opposition with one another, in constant states of rivalry and warfare. And we see numerous tablets dedicated to petty defeats, victories, and supposed divine interventions, allowing them to conquer and defeat their foes. Now, further north, eventually, around about 2300 BCE, remembering that the Sumerians themselves developed maybe sometime between 4500 BCE to around about 1900 BCE. They're the older tradition, where the Acadians are developing further to the north, and they are a ancient Semitic-speaking people. So one of the Semitic languages that would become very important for the entirety of this Middle Eastern region, as opposed to the Sumerians, who are speaking a linguistic isolate, a language that's not related to the Semitic or other languages nearby. And so these two cultures, although speaking different languages, very much share similar traditions, although the Sumerians are very much the older, more refined culture compared to their more upstartish Akkadian northern neighbours. And this is an interesting relationship because it's something that continues on. Now, whereas the Sumerians were older and constantly bickering with one another, it was the Acadians who would eventually rise up, and under the very successful conquering king, Sargon of Akkad, one of the first real emperors or empire builders the world had ever seen, the Acadians reached a new height of power, eventually controlling all of largely the entirety of the Mesopotamian area. So both the Euphrates and the Tigris, all the way up into sort of Syria, even southeast Turkey. However, this Akkadian empire, although impressive in its size when compared to the city-states that came before it, it really only flourished for about 2 centuries, between the 24th and 22nd century BCE. After Sargon's death, his successors were not really able to keep together the empire and his claims, and it eventually dissolved back down into those city-states. But it's important to know that the Sumerians and the Acadians left an extremely important tradition, which is the languages of Akkadian and Sumerian, which would become sort of like the bilingual lingua franca of the entirety of Mesopotamian culture. All subsequent cultures, regardless of how far removed from the Sumerians and the Acadians, would use Akkadian and Sumerian as the languages of court, the languages of religion, the languages of astrology, and the languages of philosophy. And so as such, I think it's important that we now turn to these languages, and one of the most important inventions of both the Sumerians and the Acadians, primarily the Sumerians, writing. So the invention of writing, which occurred in Mesopotamia, it should be noted that writing was invented independently in at least one other location, being Mesoamerica, was very much influenced by the raw material that was available. And in the case of the Mesopotamians, this was clay, living on the riverbanks of the Euphrates and the Tigris. So initially, writing was born out of a need for account keeping. Early Mesopotamian cultures, both the Sumerians and the Acadians, made use of clay tokens, with triangular tokens representing bushels of grains, and circular tokens representing heads of cattle, sheep, etc. And the thing is that this was a mechanism that was useful, however it was also a mechanism that was easily distorted and misused and potentially was forged. And so one way of sort of keeping these records safe was to seal the tokens inside a clay ball, and that way you could smash it open and prove post fact when you came to claim a debt, etc., how many things were owed. Now over time this was sort of abstracted and made more complex and simple at the same time by the impression of these clay tokens upon a clay pillow, for want of a better word, a tablet, which was then sort of sun-baked and served as a ledger, which proved exactly how many things were owed in forms of a tax record or a stock inventory. In fact, the majority of early finds of these forms of text and later writings is actually in the form of inventories and bureaucratic tax sort of documents, sort of showing how important this form of writing was to the bureaucracy of these early governments. Now over time this became even more complicated, with people using things such as seals to prove identity, so that you could link a particular tax or inventory stock or credit document to a particular individual. But once again, the symbols themselves become even more complex. We see the invention moving away from these tokens to what's called cuneiform writing, which is basically where I use a thin reed, pushing and incising into the wet clay and then sunbaking it to form different symbols. And it's this complex symbology which is originally developed by the Sumerians and then taken and used by the Acadians, which becomes the writing system that is used throughout not only Mesopotamia but also throughout peripheral regions such as up and into Mycenaean Greece, as far southeast as Bahrain, and even we see when the Egyptians are communicating to later important Mesopotamian cultures such as the Assyrians and Babylonians, they're not writing in their own hieroglyphics or demotic text, they're writing utilizing this cuneiform. And so it's one of these legacies, this sort of development of a clay text, which is so important in terms of understanding later Mesopotamian culture. But as I'll discuss later, the actual formation of the writing and how it functions within society and the role that it plays and how it is formed is so important into understanding Mesopotamian thought. In some ways, we should also be thankful that it was written on clay, because the only reason we have so many of these cuneiform texts is the fact that they were written on clay, and then not when sunbaked, but more so when a library was burned or when there was a fire, an accident on fire, when a city was sacked, the clay is baked hard and becomes almost indestructible. And as such, we have so many of these very good, reliable examples, obviously some of them somewhat damaged, which give us insight into Mesopotamian thought. After the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the history of the Mesopotamian region can really be seen as the history of two cities, of Babylon in the south and Ashur in the north. Babylon was originally an Akkadian town founded maybe 2300 BCE. However, in the 1900s, it became more important, declaring itself a center of empire in the south under a series of Amorite rulers, being Semitic-speaking peoples. And eventually, it was ruled by a King Hammurabi, famous for Hammurabi's law code. This short-lived empire, however, collapsed with the conquest of Babylonia by another Semitic-speaking peoples, the Kassites. And although it was once again ruled by a different foreign dynasty, the Babylonian Empire, or the Old Babylonian Empire, became really the heart of a Mesopotamian culture. It's where the most learned people went to learn cuneiform texts, to study to become priests, a core central aspect of being a learned and educated Babylonian or Mesopotamian, and it was perceived by a lot of its neighbouring states as the centre of wisdom and culture throughout Mesopotamia. Ashur in the north would eventually become the centre of a small kingdom known as the Assyrians. The Assyrians deriving their name from Ashur being the name of the city and the god which they worshipped as their own. Now, perceived as a cultural backwater when compared to the Babylonians, the Assyrians became more important, eventually conquering Babylon, although always perceiving it as being an important aspect, and particularly in some ways their more culturally refined subjects. And the Assyrians, however, managed to leverage their superior military might, based partially around their religion, which sort of saw Ashur as the king of all gods, and thus every time another religious or another city with a differing god rebelled against Ashur's reign, it was not only an act of rebellion or mutiny, but it was an act of sacrilege. They were able to push their empire all the way to the southwest, conquering at least the northern parts of Egypt, and all the way to the east and north, conquering the traditional domains of places such as the Hittites, and into the areas which would later be controlled by the Medes and the Persians. However, their extremely brutal reign and their extremely brutal method of dealing with rebellious subjects, including eventually the Babylonians. They burned Babylon to the ground because of the continual rebellions that were coming there because of the perception by the Babylonians they were being ruled by backward savages, resulted eventually in a alliance of different nations, including the Medes and the Babylonians and other smaller kingdoms, overthrowing the Assyrians, destroying the capital in Ashur, which was done in a very complete manner. The destruction so complete, in fact, that many of the records which had been taken from Babylon to Ashur were left there intact and eventually recovered by different Mesopotamian and Assyriologist scholars who were digging through the region later in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the Babylonians then re-established themselves as the new seat of empire, with the Neo-Babylonian Empire, once again absorbing and inheriting a lot of this Neo-Assyrian Empire which they'd just overthrown. However, the Babylonian revival was short-lived, and in around about the 600s we see the conquest of the Babylonians by the Persians, who were the erstwhile allies of the Medes to the east, and their eventual cooperation to the broader Persian culture, and later on, following the conquest of Alexander the Great, the Greco-Persian culture that emerges out of the breakup of the Alexandrian Empire. This Mesopotamian culture continues relatively uninterrupted from before the times of Sargon of Akkad all the way through past the period of Alexander into the early Roman Empire, relatively uninterrupted. And we see these important aspects of culture and writing and theology, which we'll talk about in more detail throughout the rest of this episode, as being sort of more continuous and less broken up and divided, as one was to expect with these constant cycles of warfare, conquest, and destruction. So we've talked about this continuity of culture and thought in Mesopotamia, and now I want to talk through some of the key themes within this system of thought. The first thing to note is that the Mesopotamians inhabit a very theocentric worldview. The world is seen as being based around not the needs, desires of humans, or not even being beneficial to humans, but as being the domain and control, or under the control of the gods. And it's easy to understand in some ways because of the geographic factors that these Mesopotamians were existing in. They lived in areas that were under the influence of severe flooding that wasn't regular as something that you would expect in Egypt with the Nile, but which could occur without much warning and could destroy entire cities. People that were constantly in fear of droughts, of sandstorms, dealing with the impacts and effects of disease, living in a riverine environment, and so for them the world was capricious and destructive, and their gods reflected this. It's important to note that for them the gods were that aspect of the world which destroyed them but also which saved them. So it's the floods which bring the waters, which fertilize the crops, but which also destroy the city. So in some ways it's not that the gods are evil, it's just that the gods are capable of both benevolence and hostility, and sometimes at the same time. It's important to realize that for a lot of these cultures that it was identified that finding some way to, in a very unstable and chaotic environment, to try and propitiate these deities, as was seen, was a key aspect of life. And as such, priesthoods became an extremely important aspect of Mesopotamian culture. And we see a significant portion of effort and tax revenue being put towards priesthoods, both in the form of offerings, but also in these massive mud brick ziggurats, so pyramids which were built by the Mesopotamians. When you think about the terrain, they see the gods as coming from upon high, from up in the sky, up in the mountains, and they're living down in a flat, empty plain. And so these man-made mountains were seen as an attempt to get themselves closer to heaven, closer to the gods, where they could more effectively provide their offerings. And it's interesting because you also see the development of idol worship with the development of these stone, gold, other precious metal and stone idols, which become the physical representations of the gods in these cities, and they become the focus, the loci of all this worship and these attempts to propitiate the benevolent slash malevolent deity who's in control of these cities. And it's reflected in the extremely, one could say, capricious relationship that you see in such Mesopotamian texts as the Gilgamesh epic, where Gilgamesh is, he's hubristic, but he's constantly in conflict with divine authority and power, which eventually results in some pretty nasty outcomes for himself. We'll discuss those a little bit later when we go into more depth of the Gilgamesh epic. But it's important because these theocentric worldviews become very important in sort of understanding the theistic understandings and theistic myths of other cultures, which are influenced by these earlier Mesopotamian religions. The Greeks, for instance, if you look at the Greek myth of beginning and creation in the Theogony of Hesiod, it has a lot of parallels when you look at the Enûma Eliš with that cycle of chaos and renewal and the destruction of an older generations of gods with the newer generations of gods. And at the same time, you see with the creation epic of the world coming from watery chaos being developed into and divided into the aspects of the world as we know it to be, having echoes in Hebrew mythology in Genesis with the creation myth at the start of the Bible. And so it's important to understand this religion both in itself and how theism and the very capricious gods as being a key aspect of Mesopotamian thought, but also as an influence on other later religions. Now, I've already mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first real epics which is recorded in any culture, which was lost to the world for many centuries, following its essential disappearance with a lot of early Mesopotamian culture. And it's a very interesting epic because it reflects some of those currents of thought within the Mesopotamian culture, which are key to understanding Mesopotamian thought more broadly. And one of the most important aspects is within this story, which is about the great king Gilgamesh, who, due to his hubris and his great energy, ended up sort of attracting the attention of the gods at the behest of his own people, who created this character of Enkidu, sort of a primordial Rousseauian man. And the story itself and the tight friendship they form after a very rocky first meeting, and the taming of Gilgamesh by means of first the hunter but then the seductress, is sort of this analogy for that conflict and complementarity between the urban and the rural lifestyle, the wild versus the civil. And it's an interesting contrast because it's important to understand that due to the nature of society in Mesopotamia, over 95% of the population were estimated to be living in cities. And so there's sort of this, in some ways, hearkening for this more wild or traditional lifestyle, but this sort of a rejection at the same time and preference for that more urban and sophisticated lifestyle represented by Gilgamesh. Although Gilgamesh and Enkidu do sort of make peace and eventually go off on their own adventures, it's actually the adventures they go on and the fact that they continue to deny hubristically the will of the gods that eventually leads to an even more important aspect of Mesopotamian thought and culture. Due to Gilgamesh's and Enkidu's hubris, they essentially draw the wrath of the gods to the point where Enkidu is essentially doomed to die. He's poisoned with a disease by the gods, and it's in Enkidu's death where he goes forth and ends up cursing the seductress as well as Gilgamesh for some time before he eventually repents for civilizing him and bringing him into the evils of culture within the city. That we see Gilgamesh coming to terms with his own mortality, which sets him off on his own quest, eventually to meet with the immortal survivor of the great flood that originally destroyed humanity. Something an echo of the Noah myth we find in, once again, the Bible, or at least the Old Testament. Now, in some ways, this aspect of Gilgamesh's story is talking about the fate that is a thread common to all human lives, the mortality that none of us can escape. In fact, the Babylonian interpretation of the underworld is fairly grim, something similar or akin to the interpretations found in the Odyssey, or even in the Old Testament when talking about Sheol or Hades, where it's a dark, grim place, not some sort of beautiful heavenly afterlife as is interpreted in later theistic and particularly Abrahamic traditions. However, it is at the end of the book of Gilgamesh's epic that we see Gilgamesh sort of pride swelling in his chest as he surveys the city of which he is still king, and sort of coming to terms with the fact that although he must die, he sort of lives on in the good will and the good deeds that he's performed for his own city. And it's this interesting sort of very tragic conception of humanity, which we then see later reflected in other traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean, such as the Greek and the Egyptian, which is, and to some degree the Jewish, which is important in understanding later Western traditions as well. So, the Babylonians have a theistic worldview, theocentric worldview I should say, and they also have this rather fatalistic understanding of human existence. So, and when these two combine, we see very much a focus on trying to interpret the world as a collection of signs from the gods, and this manifests itself in many different ways, but it's this mechanism of trying to understand the warnings or the futures that are laid out before us by the gods, who are existing in all things and provide all of this knowledge to those who are willing to know and understand it. And for the Mesopotamians, came in many different ways. It came in the form of reading sheep's and goat's livers when sacrifices were made. It came from the sprinkling of oil or flour and reading the ripples on the surface, the differing flights of birds, the movements of planets and stars, and even malformed births, which they saw as particularly auspicious or inauspicious depending on the time and the place in which they occurred. And it's important to understand that all these signs are extremely contextual. Depending if they occurred on the left or the right hand side, the same sign could be either both auspicious or inauspicious. And if it occurred on certain times of the day, or if it occurred in an even or odd number of occurrences, these could have either negative or positive tellings. And so we see in the Babylonian or Mesopotamian, more broadly, conception of the world a very symbolic interpretation of how reality exists. And these symbolisms are generally derived and drawn out in a list of different omens, which is generally copied down, where there is a if-then relationship. And so if something occurs, then a certain outcome is likely to occur. And these aren't necessarily empirical observations. It's not as though the Babylonians are seeing something having occurred, then looking back at the signs that have occurred, and then extrapolating some sort of crude causational effect. But rather we see symbology actually creating impossible signs. So movements in the stars that could not possibly have occurred, and then still being given some sort of positive or negative occurrence into the future. And so it's more like an interweaving mesh of symbols, which allow the Babylonians or Mesopotamians more broadly to interpret their worldview. So, as we've previously explored, writing is key to understanding Mesopotamian culture. And it's key because, once you understand how important symbology is within the Mesopotamian concept, you can understand how the Mesopotamian cuneiform system doesn't necessarily simplify over time, and is so key to understanding the transmission of Mesopotamian culture and thought. It also explains in some way why it didn't necessarily flow over as effectively as, say, Egyptian thought and culture into other cultures such as the Greeks and the Romans. So, when you're looking at these Babylonian cuneiform ideograms, it's able to not only convey particular words, which can be conveyed rather simply, but which are each symbol is poignant with its own meaning, which provides both some sort of auspiciousness or inauspiciousness on the method and manner in which it was written, but also conveys meaning and layers and depth of understanding that aren't conveyed purely by the spoken word. So, for instance, this explains why in tax records the term gur, which refers to a grain heap, which can be represented quite easily with a four-stroke simple ideogram, is generally referred to by a rather complex interlocking mixture of different symbols. And it's interesting because this mixture of symbols, once again, it has some sort of key meaning within the context of understanding grain and grain heap, because otherwise over time it would have been simplified rather than retaining this much more complex nature. It's also important to understand because the way that the Mesopotamians thought was in some ways constrained, much in the way that our own thinking is constrained by the language they utilized. So, for instance, when making these massive word lists, which were something quite important done for students of Babylonian cuneiform text and writing, they would often logically group things in manners that don't at first seem obvious to us. A great example is that they would often divide animals between domesticated and wild. However, the symbol for pig, because it was a wild symbol being derived from the wild boar symbol, meant that domesticated pigs would also be lumped with wild pigs, and therefore wild animals such as lions and wolves. Same with the symbol for dog being derived from wolf, saw that these domesticated animals being lumped with wild animals, not on the basis of their utility, but on the basis of the symbol which constructed their name. And in this sense, Babylonian knowledge and Mesopotamian knowledge more broadly doesn't fall into these neat sort of conceptual categories that we see in other thinkers such as Aristotle in the Greek tradition, which makes us need to re-examine how logical and how universal these Aristotelian traditions of logic and thought are. In some sense, rather than a branching tree, maybe a sort of a subsoil tuber system with an interlinking mesh of roots is a better conception for understanding the Babylonian system of logic and knowledge. In this sense, a system in which every individual object is its own symbol, and that symbols can be grouped on the basis of numerous different identity layers, both within the object itself, within the symbols which are used to represent the object, and then the way that that symbol can then be construed, either auspiciously or inauspiciously, when telling the future in the form of astrology, or auspicy, or some other form of fortune telling. Now to cast back to earlier in this particular episode, I'm going to talk about an aspect of law and kingship which comes from the example of Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi was famous less so for the short-lived empire which he created, but more so for the codes that he created. Sort of a symbol of law that was utilized by later thinkers and was preserved on into the legal traditions, even considered by some in the Western tradition of common and Roman law as being at the font of their own judicial systems or legal systems. So Hammurabi's legal system was sort of very much in that biblical tradition of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Almost to an obscene or obscure extent. So, for instance, if a brickmaker made a shoddy wall, and that wall collapsed on a person, then the brickmaker could be killed. However, if the brickmaker's wall fell on someone's son, then it was the brickmaker's son who would be killed. This seems rather draconian or crazy, in fact, but once again we see it's a very logical linking within the Mesopotamian system of thought between how a action occurs and then equal and equivalent action occurring logically within the system of thought. It should be noted, however, that Hammurabi's legal text doesn't necessarily seem to have much influence on law as it is actually practiced. From what few legal records actually exist from ancient Mesopotamia, it seems more that these laws existed as some sort of understanding to the local populace that there was some basis upon which legal decisions were made, and not actually honoured in the actual conduct of legal or judicial procedures. So, if we could sum up Mesopotamian system of logic, drawing upon these ideas of fatalism, of symbolism, of writing, of legal theory, how can we understand this Mesopotamian logic? I think it's rather simple. It's in this conception of if blank, then blank. It's this understanding of a causal relationship between a precursor and a successor action, a predicate and a subject. And it's really this formalization of thought which is logical within its own system, which eventually leads to and brings to those other forms of thought, not necessarily directly, but definitely indirectly, into conceptions such as the draconic and Roman legal modes in Greece or in Rome, which leads on even into, you could argue, the auspicy and other forms of fortune telling, which are seen throughout the Near East and into the Eastern Mediterranean, and then to a lesser degree can be seen as the roots and basis of logic which then comes later in other traditions. Although one cannot underplay the own individual genius and creativity of those local cultures in the way that they develop and utilize some of these strands of thought which developed in earlier culture. So now we turn to the question of what is the enduring influence of the Babylonian and Mesopotamian traditions, and more importantly, why is it important for us to understand and study? Well, the Babylonian conception of if-then is important to understand later legal traditions in Greece, Rome, but also within the Hebrew traditions. And more importantly, it's important to understand the Mesopotamian origins of myth and theocentricity, which become very important in their own right within the Jewish traditions. And realistically, you can only really understand the Old Testament within the context of the Enûma Eliš and broader Mesopotamian culture. Finally, from a scientific standpoint, some of those aspects of astrology and astronomy, which we're talking about in those understandings of symbology and fortune telling, were really fundamentally important in terms of understanding the conception of nature, or at least eventually the conception of the cosmology of the world and the movements of the heavens, which would be taken up by later the Greeks and the Egyptians. And realistically, the astronomy of the Babylonians forms a foundation upon which even modern science draws to some degree. Thank you for listening to this episode of Foolish Musings. If you enjoyed this episode, you can either follow me at my blog at foolishmusings.com or subscribe for more videos.